Hello and welcome to our professional development series produced by Publishing Professionals Network. Our aim is to um, bring speakers in who can help enhance the careers of publishing professionals. And tonight, I'm pleased and honored to introduce the multi-talented Valerie Haynes Perry, who is an author, motivational writing coach, editor, and indexer. And her experience in multiple facets of the publishing world give her a unique and valuable perspective on the alchemy that is writing, the process that the entire publishing world is built on. So welcome, Valerie, and thank you so much for giving us your time tonight.
My pleasure, Becky. Thanks to all of you for inviting me.
I'd like to start by asking you, how did you get started as an author coach?
It started when I was working as a development editor. Well, just quickly, I worked as a development editor for a time at Ziff Davis Press in Emeryville. Some of you may remember Ziff Davis Press. And after being a development editor for several years, I just couldn't resist writing something of my own. So that's how I got to the point where I became an author so that I could be an author coach. And the way the coaching came into play was in 2016. I had a table with a dear friend who is also an author at the Bay Area Book Festival in Berkeley. And after we had set up our table, this one person walked by who was kind of curious about what we were doing there. So I made eye contact with that person. She approached the table. We had a wonderful conversation. I started it by asking her if she was a writer. And as so many people do, they will kind of work their way into a yes. So gratefully, that was the case with Mia. And she had to run off and go to some talks that were happening at the book festival. She came back the next day, said she had read the book and was so motivated to write that after the weekend of the book festival was over, I just couldn't let go of that energy. I had to find a way to continue to connect with writers. So within a month, this concept of motivational writing came to mind, and I did an internet search and did not find it, which is always like a good omen in my experience. So I ran an ad on Meetup for a while, and a few writers showed up from there. I invited a few writers I knew already. And in September of 2016, we started meeting and have been going ever since. In fact, we're up to 4 writing circles per month now.
So motivational writing is a particular area of writing. Can you say more about that?
Yes, motivational writing is a very straightforward practice that just requires that the writer be serious about writing, meaning that he or she has a work in progress that he or she is devoted to finishing within a very supportive community of writers. And what we actually do when we get together is each writer reads aloud their work in progress. When they finish, I ask each writer the same 3 questions. How do you feel about what you just wrote? Did anything about reading it surprise you? And would you like input about your writing? So by asking those 3 simple questions, which writers always anticipate, there's always a different answer. And the whole purpose is to emphasize and encourage self-empowerment, because what I had found in other writing groups that I'd been in, I felt that that power could be usurped from the writer by, there is this kind of mean-spiritedness that I experienced that could develop where other writers would become so critical and get into this thing of commenting, and the comments weren't really useful. So after going to several of those groups, I just felt that I needed something different. And the something different is that we always offer input in a very supportive way. We're devoted to helping each writer gain clarity about his or her work so that we can help them bolster their own intentions about their work. So the three things that are very important are the reading aloud, developing a sense of unshakable clarity, and also, I'll say, unshakable intentionality. And the reason I emphasize those words is I think where writers have uncomfortable feelings about their writing based on what someone might have told them in their past or some life experience, if a writer can get to the point that anybody can say anything beautiful or negative, and they can basically say, okay, I've written the book that I intended to write, I'm clear about my purpose, you're protected. And perhaps this is something we'll get to a little bit later in terms of just some of the fears that writers can quite naturally and for very understandable reasons have about taking themselves seriously as writers.
Thank you. So you spoke about the three steps or the three things that come up in each meeting for each writer. Do you find that those three, the combination of those three, that those really are the best combination to motivate writers who run into roadblocks or who are, just, maybe lose some of their intentionality?
It's funny, there are certain words that I personally tend to avoid, and one of them is best, or is that the best way? And another part of what we do is we're very fluid. So while we stick to that as our foundation, the conversation might bring in some other questions based on what we perceive the author's needs to be, or what the author tells us he or she needs. So I would say that rather than the best way, there are many roads to reach a particular destination. So we have found within the various circles over the past 4 going into 5 years that this approach works really well for us.
Now, you say that the writers that you're working with currently, they all have works in progress. So it sounds as though most of them are, have some experience with the writing process. Have you worked with brand new authors who are just starting, who are really just starting to imagine putting down their thoughts into book form?
I have, and that's the thing. That actually applies to several of the writers who've been in the circle going into our 5th year. In fact, I'm thinking of one writer who came in, you just, had a story as we all do, and just, was brave enough to share it. And we were sitting around talking one day. And so I said, how was that for you? And she said, oh, I hate writing. I just hate it. And she kept coming back, and she continues to come back, and we get to tease her and say, so remember when you felt that way? And she said, oh, she kind of worked her way up to saying, actually, I really enjoy it. But it kind of took that other step of, it's getting better. I like it better than I did at first. But it's certainly something she has grown into. So yes, many writers yes, I have worked with writers who really considered themselves to be new to writing, but many of them have also been journalers since childhood. So that is certainly, I'll say, valid, not that I am trying to stamp approval on anything that anybody writes that's, meaningful. But yeah, there are a lot of writers who are journalers, and that really, in fact, one of the writers, or at least one, two actually, has turned journal entries, actually possibly 3, several writers have turned journal entries into books.
Now, writing a journal is very different than writing a book, because a journal, you're doing it for yourself. I just read an interview the other day with Barack Obama, who said that he's been an avid journalist since he was a teenager, and he's continued that onto the present day, and that's what he uses as sort of a basis for his writing. But still, he said it was very difficult to make that transition from journaling, which you do for yourself, into something that is you know, for public consumption. And he said there's nothing more terrifying than a blank page. And I imagine that it must be sort of terrifying to take your, you know, really your sort of stream of consciousness, whatever form you keep a journal in, and say, okay, how am I going to open myself up this way to the public? Have you had experience with trying to convince people that yes, your, you know, your private experiences, your private thoughts, you know, really can translate into something that not only you can read out loud in this writing circle, but that can be, you know, out there for the whole world?
Yes, two things. First, I want to mention, thank you for that question and for all of the thoughtful questions. For all of the a note just
Sorry, I didn't mean to
popped up.
distract.
No worries. Mimi, if it's okay, Mimi was saying, yeah, a blank canvas can be kind of scary for visual artists.
I'm telling you.
Let's like kind of explore what kinds of intersections there are between these two experiences. Two things come to mind in response to that, your question, Becky. First of all, I think President Obama is such an excellent example of what so many writers experience in deciding what they wish to bring from the journal to a published book, because I would imagine, given the difficulties of his presidency, it was quite, you know, I can only imagine his inner turmoil and all, you know, I can't imagine what he went through. So that's kind of a macrocosm, I think, for those of us who have nowhere near that level of responsibility. So the thing that we do in writing circles, it's kind of interesting what happens as the writer's comfort level grows, where recently writers have felt so safe and so free to self-express in circles. Sometimes what will happen is the circle as a whole will say, yeah, you know, feel free to go deeper and deeper into that experience. And at that point, I have to kind of pause and say to the writer, remember, you are totally empowered to disclose anything you want, but that does not mean that you need to tell all. So by keeping that balance, it's important to remind writers of just that, is to create safe boundaries for yourself. Be careful that you don't trigger something. And in this work, folks do come and they will reveal things for the very first time in other people. And there is a lot of emotion that comes up. And that's another thing, is we maintain the level of confidentiality that's maintained in a therapist's office or a doctor's office, because it is therapeutic. I don't have the degree, and I make that clear to everyone, but the work we do is collectively is therapeutic. So it always comes back to empowering, Becky, so that the writer is clear that they are always in control of how much they divulge.
Speaking of how much, following up on that, once writers do get started, do you feel that they should, in order to keep their momentum, that they should concentrate on just output, you know, putting, you know, writing as much as they can, or they should really sort of dial down and make, you know, not so much like focus on quantity, but quality?
That is very individual. And I think this might be a good place to distinguish between technical writing and other kinds of writing, because I mentioned I was a development editor for several years. And so at that time, I'm not sure how it's changed, but schedules drove everything. Product releases drove everything. So there is just not the luxury to say, yeah, take your time, you know, work your way through, you know, developing your literary voice to write this book on the latest release of Word, you know, or whatever. So in a case where it really is very production driven, if the writer is working with a development editor, it makes sense, I feel, to focus on quantity rather than quality, because after the first or second chapter, best case, the development editor will have worked out a way to help the writer improve her or his writing, so that, say, in a 10-chapter book, by the third, fourth, or fifth chapter, the writer will really be cruising. And best case, if there's a good relationship, a good rapport that's developed between the writer and the development editor, things will go smoothly and the quality will improve later on. Now, to be honest, I don't know how that works, because I was a development editor. I don't know how it works if a writer just turns over writing to a copy editor. So I don't know. There's some tricky factors that can be involved, but on the more, I'll say, creative side, meaning fiction or something non-technical, but still nonfiction, where there's some leeway to use more creativity. Again, if the writer is not driven by a schedule, it's all about working with the writer. In coaching writers, I just check in with them. Okay, we came up with an outline last week, and we talked about you working on chapter 6. And they might come back and say, I feel like working on chapter 2 right now. Or so, to make a long story short, I think it's important to just stay in a flow with the writer so that they're doing what they want to do. And the main part of that is for me to listen to them so that I can help them arrive at that clarity and intentionality that was mentioned before. So I think those are two distinct differences. Why impose the pressure of a schedule if you really don't need to? Although several writers will say, well, I'm basically done with this book, but somebody told me I just should just show it to an editor for the heck of it. And in just about every case, 3-4 months later, it's like, I want to write something different, or, I really do want to take my time with this. So it's just keeping that close contact with the writer or the author is, I think, the most important thing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, a lot of people who have been involved in professional publishing, they are more familiar with the schedule-driven. I mean, within a publishing company environment, they're more driven by the production schedule, and it can be frustrating. Motivation, or just sort of can't seem to find a way forward. Um, and as you say, it's very different when something's not driven by a schedule. But uh, can you give us some, from your experience, some examples of some of the roadblocks or just some of the challenges that writers have come up against where they're really not, they're having trouble with their motivation or their momentum or their confidence?
Really having simple conversations along the way, finding out what types of roadblocks we're dealing with. Are you having a really difficult time with the writing? I actually did quite a bit of ghostwriting, which is how I got into my own writing. I love to rewrite. So sometimes that was the solution. I would basically do a lot of the writing myself. But it depends on the nature of the roadblock. If you developing a good rapport with the writer, and you find out there is some personal thing, it's not a matter of finding out what's going on specifically, but if they say, I just haven't slept, or what have you. So I think the first thing is really to identify the cause of the roadblock and to find ways to find solutions from there. So again, it's a very individual thing. I don't know, Becky, if you can think of a specific thing, I'd be happy to let you know if something comes up. And the other thing I'll admit is I'm so solution oriented, I kind of like leap over roadblocks. So it's like I don't even hear the word roadblock. At the same time, I want to make sure I address the question well.
Oh, I think that that's a really good start, and I'll actually leave it up to our audience to come up with some experiences they've had in their lives. Um, I mentioned that a lot of publishing professionals, have most of their experience within a publishing house, but now, as we know, self-publishing is really sort of growing by leaps and bounds. And I think that, I think in the main, that's a great thing because there aren't these, four major publishing company gatekeepers saying, yes, you deserve to be published, and no, sorry, you do not. So I think that that's really a great boon for both authors and readers um, and editors and other people who, help people bring their self-published works to into being. And one thing that I've thought about, I have not done this professionally, but one thing I've thought about is that the publishing process is pretty arcane to people who are coming into it from the outside. And so if somebody is coming to you as either an editor or a writing coach, and they say, well, yes, I think it's just about finished, but I was told I need all these things. How important do you think it is that somebody understands what you would do as a writing coach versus a development editor versus a copy editor versus, a production or art director? How important do you think it is that somebody sort of understand that from the outset? Or do you think that could be kind of overwhelming?
I think for a new author, it could be overwhelming. And again, I just really like to ask people how they feel about things. So in that case, I would say, would you like to learn about the whole process? And I find by asking an honest question, usually honest questions often yield what feel to be honest answers. It's like, no, maybe later on in the process we can deal with that. But seriously, it depends on what the intentions are of the author. If the author is seeing this body of work that he or she wants to create, then yeah, let's kind of take it step by step so that you know that there's an editorial phase, there's a production phase, because that, as we all know, that will make the process go much more smoothly. So the difference between something like getting a sample chapter where there are all of these notes, yeah, write this part later, write that part later, it basically an incomplete submission, just certain things like that. So making sure that runs smoothly as part of the process, or in that particular case, making sure the author understands it's like, okay, you write the chapter, you send it to me, I review it, I make some comments, I give it back to you, I get your author review, and then it needs to go on to production or whatever, So I don't think writers or authors really need to know that much about the production process unless they're doing something that's graphics heavy. But again, it's been a long time since I've done it. So I would start by just asking, how much do you want to know about the process? And then from there, just let them know as we go through the various delivery dates for things, rather than, just tell them the whole thing at once.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Or they might ask, they might want to say, well, so what happens? And then by the time you get, to the fifth thing, it's like, nah, I'm good.
Right? Let's leave it a mystery here.
Right.
So in your writing circle, have you had the experience of, having been part of the publishing world? Have you had the experience of kind of motivating people even past the writing stage as they've moved forward to publication?
Let me think. To be honest, Becky, everybody is really taking their time. I'm thinking one writer published her book, and quite interestingly, she had a significant disability. And she was clear, she was in and out, and she's the first one to have published her book. But everybody is getting closer to publishing their books at the first time. And in fact, I'm in the process of working with a writer to self-publish a book.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, everybody's just kind of pacing themselves. And everybody knows they will know when they're done with the book. Although, I do prod them from time to time, because something I put in my book, Write the Book You Want, Be Your Own Coach is there is a song that never ends. Excuse me, from Sesame Street. Remember that song? This is a song that never ends. Yes, it goes on and on, my friend. So it's just like this loop. So I do remind writers that one of our objectives is to commit to completing a work in progress. So that's kind of a whole other topic is what gets in the way of finishing books for writers sometimes. That's kind of an ongoing discussion, really.
Mhm. Have you personally had that experience of having it be difficult for you to finish a book as a writer?
No, because I enjoy each part of the process so much. Completion is one of my favorite parts of the process. I don't rush to completion, but I love the way it feels to finish writing a book. I'm working on my 11th book right
Oh,
now.
congratulations. That's amazing.
Thank you. Thank you.
Now, it sounds as though when you say write the book you want, be your own coach, you're in danger of, if you're successful, of putting yourself out of a job. So do you think that authors really can be their own coaches, or do you think it's really vital to have that outside connection? Somebody who is maybe looking at what you're writing a little more objectively, or what do you think about that? Just having another person involved. How
That's
important is it?
again, I hate to be so unoriginal in the answers, but it's true. It's an individual thing. So for myself, I've written traditional books. I wrote some books about writing, and now I'm doing this very experimental thing. And, I share it with writers in the circle. On occasion, I'll work with a writing partner, but I'm also okay with just saying, this is a book I wanted to write, so I'm ready to self-publish it. So it's very individualized. Now, the thing that makes it easy is I'm not trying to write a bestseller necessarily, so I'm not doing any marketing or promotion. So clearly, for those writers who are all about marketing and promotion and building platforms and having agents and connecting with traditional publishers, yeah, then you do need editorial input. But then being in the unique position of having been an editor, which is an advantage, which is not to say that my work can't use editing anyway. I'm comfortable with generally the way I edit my own books, or if I want someone else's input, I know folks whose judgment and abilities I trust, so I ask them.
Mhm, mhm. And so you think there are some authors who can really sort of do it for themselves, who can keep, coach themselves and keep motivated, stay motivated and stay focused on their intentionality?
It's funny, that makes me think this is the first time I'm thinking about this question. I love all of your questions, Becky, but I'm thinking of how some folks say, well, writing is such a lonely enterprise. You sit in some room by yourself. It's just, that whole thing. And writing fiction, you know, I'm always entertained by my characters. It's like there's a whole party going on lots of times. So in terms, I think the serious answer to your question has to do with discipline. And also, yeah, absolutely, editors serve an extremely important function. I mean, no doubt. And I think with the subtitle of the book, Be Your Own Coach, I mean that, but also it feeds into the empowerment. Is just have so much clarity and confidence in your work because you worked hard to produce the book. That not to sound arrogant, it's like nobody can really tell you that what you did is wrong. It should be done this way or that way because you have clarity about the book you wrote, just as anyone else can if they choose to. So I just love the work so much and just really want to help anyone who's receptive to what I have to offer. If it turns out everybody I work with says, thanks, Valerie, we're into coaching ourselves now. you know, that would be a beautiful thing also. And I'll just continue to write my work and see if I connect with some new writers. Although I love the community of writers. I absolutely love the community of writers I work with.
I had a question. Well, while I'm thinking of the question that was in my mind, I want to ask the audience if anybody has a question that they want to introduce to the conversation. I think maybe, are we using the raise hand feature or?
There we go. I think I should unmute myself. As far as I can tell, I think anybody who wants to can unmute themselves. It's not like a big giant crowd here, so I think it's okay to just go ahead and speak up if you have a question. I do, but I'm going to let other folks go first. So.
I have one. When you're writing, how do you do it? How do you schedule yourself? Do you write for 3 hours a day like Somerset Maugham did? Do you sit down and just go, and then 36 hours later you realize it's a day and a half later? How do you work when you're writing?
I write in a notebook, a composition book that I take with me when I'm just out and about, and I just let everything collect until I'm ready to sit down and put it in the computer. So it's interesting. I'm finding that scheduling isn't working for a lot of writers. And it seems during COVID, I'm running into that quite a bit, where I'll work out a schedule with a writer and it's like, no, I just wasn't able to do that. So it's a work in progress like so many other things, but right now that's working really well, is to just bring my little notebook, and that is a paper notebook and a pen, and write ideas as they come. And then what happens when I sit down at the computer, they just kind of multiply. That's when the real volume happens.
Nice.
I think that segues nicely to my question, because you mentioned COVID and all. And I was wondering, I just wrote this down, how has your working with authors been affected by the pandemic, and in processes, and how you build the relationships, and also, so what are you doing differently? And also, what are some silver linings? Because I think a lot of us are finding, despite all the heaviness of it all, that there's some really good things coming out of this, because we're all focusing differently on what's really valuable. And so I was wondering if there's silver linings and maybe things that you'll be continuing post-pandemic as part of your practice.
What a great question, Mimi, and yours as well, David. Thank you both. Yeah. There are 4 cohorts right now, and one, for the core cohort, we've actually been in a room together. We breathe the same air without masks, and we've interacted in that way. So the translation to Zoom, we all made it really smoothly. It's like we're still in the room together, because we know how it really feels. And then I've met all but one writer, and it's interesting. This writer actually found out about this work on YouTube, of all places. And that's kind of a side story. But I was meeting with this writer recently, and he was talking, and he said something. He was like in his creative mode, and then he went into this tech mode. He's a technical person. And I said something just shifted, and we got into this conversation about intuitiveness that can happen on the screen. And he said, my goodness, you could tell that my mood shifted in Zoom. So I'm finding that this work is entirely energetic. In sitting in a room with people, it's easy for me to kind of sense hesitation, or to sense a lot of things, just because of the way, just because. So I'm finding it's providing some interesting ways to just deepen a sense of intuition, even in this 2D framework. So it's, I don't know, it's an enhancement in a certain sense. Nobody has to find parking. it's easier to show up on time. If you don't feel like dressing up or something like that, you just, turn off your video. And I don't know, I'm finding that adapting to this flow of energy is happening the energy flow is happening pretty seamlessly. It's kind of, I've done some teaching and I really was never into online teaching because there's something different about being in a room and feeling that energy, in my opinion. But anyway, as far as the coaching work, it's translating beautifully.
I'm so glad to hear that.
Thank you. Thanks.
I wonder if people might, feel more or less kind of inhibited about sharing their work via Zoom rather than with, actual people in a room.
Not so far, but that could become an issue over time. Are you kind of referring or alluding to privacy issues or?
No. Just because you say it's, it is a different type of energy. I mean, you're going to get a different, I think I would feel that you would get a different sort of type of vibrations back in people reacting to your work, when it's on a screen rather than when it's in person. So I'm wondering if that seems to have made any change in how people feel about sharing their work. But it sounds like that like the people you're working with are pretty used to that at this point, to sharing their work.
They are. That's something I want to think about more. But yeah, it hasn't made a difference. And I think it's because the writers are just so devoted to the work. It's like, hey, if we need to meet under a rock somewhere, let's do that,
I see Terry has a really good question. I mean, all these have been really good questions. Have you worked with authors who are strictly self-published and need distribution systems? Do you include coaching on what happens after the book is published?
I avoid that like the plague. And I take the question seriously, but I'm really clear that I'm just involved. And part of it has to do with my own personal experience. I had an agent for a couple of years and went the traditional route and that whole thing, and eventually came to self-publishing. But no, I have made the choice to focus all of my energy on creating the biggest body of work that I can, something that I feel really good about. So no, I wish, I really can't think of any good, I don't have any distribution experience.
I would like to just make a comment that as a designer or book producer myself, it's a real dichotomy. You want to help someone do a really good book, but if they don't have a publisher, the task of selling it is, it's another whole thing. And it's like, there's a certain amount of ego that goes into publishing if you're a self-published author and you want to do this, especially if you're a first-time author. But getting them to understand that just getting a really fine book is one stage of it. There's a whole other back end to this that you've got to work with. And I'm just looking for ways to help that process along, because there are projects I would love to take, but without any following, for instance, from a certain author, whatever, there's just not necessarily a way to distribute it unless you actually help them find a publisher, and then take the aspect of becoming a literary agent after the book is written.
I'm so glad you brought that up, Terry, because I'm thinking of one writer who was so excited about working on her first book. She had a job, and she was thinking she was going to be able to quit her job. And for, writers who have that particular aspiration, it is kind of tricky. I'm grateful when writers don't ask me, about the possibility of that happening, and they generally don't because we stay focused on producing the book. But that is hard, to put your heart and soul into something and then have it sit on a shelf. You give it to friends, family, that sort of thing. Maybe you go to a few book festivals or whatnot. I am so far out of that loop. I don't know how people are getting published anymore. I really don't.
So how do you as a coach deal with that, as Terry said, it can be very disappointing to put all this work into it. And I mean, as a coach, do you try and steer them away from that sort of ultimate expectation and have them focus more just on the writing? And what's that process like?
Again, I am clear on what my role is. I can help people write their books, and I don't, because the approach is entirely positive, and just because of who I am, far be it for me to say, it's going to be really difficult to try to sell this book. And it's just out of my purview. So, and honestly, the question doesn't come up. Personally, because the writers are so devoted and so focused. We focus on completing books. And so, yeah, it really, I kind of want to respond a little more deeply. For myself, I just love writing so much, and it's just so beautiful when somebody says, Valerie, I read your book. It's just like this euphoric experience, so that's enough for me. And yes, I hope plenty of people read my books because they find them valuable. But, the question just doesn't come up.
There is a question about publicists and all. There's a woman a publicist who I've met through Bay Area Women in Publishing, who's just delightful. Her name is Fausia Burke, and one of her main career focuses or jobs or profession is to be a publicist to self-publishing people. And she has this amazing energy. So I thought maybe I could share her email in the chat, or not email, website in the chat. She's great, and I want to work with her. So as a designer, if she gets an author who needs a designer, that's what
I think. I have her book, Online Publishing for Busy Authors, and I can recommend that book. And also, I believe one of her clients is Alan Alda.
Oh, really?
I believe at one time he was. Yeah, I visited her website. So yeah, she sounds like a good resource.
Yeah.
One of the things that you mentioned as a possible kind of challenge for writers to get over is having received negative feedback in the past about their writing. That seems like it would present, a real challenge for people to feel, to develop confidence in themselves. Can you talk a little bit about the experience you've had with that, with writers?
Yeah, that's a process in itself. It's always so uplifting when a writer returns to the circle, because at some point during the first circle, it's not unusual for them to talk about some damaging experience, or they'll ask questions, they present an idea, and writers will actually say, oh, I can do that. And to just say, of course you can do that. It's your book. You can do anything you want with it, is to just continue to emphasize the self-empowerment. So in terms it, with any type of therapy, quite frankly, it takes a long time to work through a lot of negative issues. If somebody's been say if someone as a child showed a book to an adult, and it's like, oh, that's nonsense. You need to, get a job. You'll never make money. by those things, by writing. It takes a lot of time for folks to undo that. And that's where journaling can come in handy. And to just, if you find yourself, if you know you're a writer, just do it. And again, a lot of writers who are overcoming intense negativity are journalers. And that's where they took their writing when they received their when they were receptive to negative input. So it's a healing process.
I remember a number of years ago, maybe a decade or so ago, there was a lot of sort of new focus on writing programs, like postgraduate writing programs. And one of the criticisms was that that they tended to turn out people who would write in a New Yorker style, or a this style or that style, and that it was all very similar. How do you try to, in a group that you're involved with, how do you try to avoid either kind of people starting to be too influenced by other styles, and how can editors, especially if they're frustrated writers themselves or hopeful writers themselves, how can editors kind of keep from unintentionally imposing their style on a writer?
Becky, that is such an intense question. I'll be honest, I haven't thought of it before, so I'm going to just kind of see where this goes. The first part of your question with writing for the New Yorker, that kind of aspiration, that involves giving over your power to someone else, letting them tell you, you're good enough for us. And just, if you happen to be a gambler or something like that, and think of the chances of writing the perfect book for someone, I think it's important to do reality checks. And because when manuscripts are submitted to agents, there's often, in my experience and what I understand, there's a lot of back and forth. In fact, I'm thinking of a writer now who's gone through a lot of editions, a lot of editing with her agent. So it's like, okay, the writer gives this to the agent gives this to the publisher. Oh, take out chapter 5. Okay, there's back and forth. Oh no, that's the most important chapter. Okay, I did it. Put half of chapter 5 back in. So it can be another song that never ends that is totally, totally market driven. And the market can change on a dime. So to get back to your question of striking a balance between knowing how to, you cannot make someone accept your writing. You just can't do it. I think possibly one exception, I heard Anne Lamott tell a story one time about how she had submitted, it might have been Bird by Bird. She went to New York and, she'd gotten rejected, but she went to New York and camped out in the editor's office, cried, had a fit, and they accepted her book. So there, I guess that's an example of perseverance or something like that. So that's one example where that happened. But your question about editors who might have certain issues of their own.
Well, it's more about sort of someone who's working with a writer unintentionally sort of imposing their style, whether it's the leader of a writing program, or whether it's a writing coach, or whether it's other people in the writing circle, unintentionally imposing their style on what another writer is doing.
I think in a case like that, the best thing that could happen would be that one of the writers were astute enough to call the teacher on that, and of course there could be all kinds of consequences to that. But let's see. Yeah, it would depend.
If you have a very close writing relationship, whether it's with a author motivator, or whether it's with an editor or a writing teacher, you know, the writer is, I think especially a new writer, is open. And if an editor or someone they're working with says, you know, I don't know about this word you're using, or I don't know about this phrase, or this scene, you know, really sort of, it does this or that, you know, I mean, you really, you know, you're a little bit vulnerable as a writer to, you know, how do you, I don't know, this question is kind of wandering around, but how do you make sure that a writer is, you know, knows to hold on to what is their essence, you know, and it's not influenced by outside kind of more powerful or more experienced people?
That's a really intense question. I think it all comes down to chemistry and trial and error, because I bounced around to different writing groups and didn't find what I needed. So I was open to creating something of my own. So in that case, yeah, I really feel for writers in that position for all of the reasons that you say. They go and they're vulnerable. Best case, the writing coach, the teacher would say, my goodness, this is such an interesting way you've used this word. Would you tell me more about, do you remember where that came from? But then that's where what you were alluding to before comes in. If the teacher is a writer himself or herself, it can be difficult for certain people to be objective. So in terms of, you know, I think it just has to be trial and error, you know, and that's why motivational writing exists, because we are a place where you can come and we will work to understand you rather than, that's another thing that's so important with this practice, is encouraging listeners to do more of the work to understand the writer rather than the writer having to make something more palatable to an audience. And my goodness, this goes against everything in the traditional publishing industry. It's about writing to the formula. Let's, you know, nail this market. Let's look at these demographics. But, you know, I personally feel readers can work a little harder to understand writers who've worked really hard on their books and have clarity about what their purposes were. But it takes a long time to get to that point, and a lot of writers never make it. So I would just hope that writers in the position that you just mentioned, you know, someone is saying, you know, this word just doesn't work, use something else. I would hope they would say why.
Mhm, mhm.
I have a question. Um,
David.
Yes, that's who I am. Yeah, it's this. You know, this. I've in my career in publishing, I've tended to work in certain areas of publishing. So, for example, professional reference titles, computing titles, where there was a certain need for it to comply to a market. Not so, sometimes it was a formula. Sometimes it was a formula, particularly if it was a series-driven book. But there's also certain market expectations and certain ways the readerships absorb that information, right? And even now in my current position where I'm in academic publishing, University Press academic publishing, again, in fact, maybe even more so, there's a real rigid sense of how things are supposed to be presented. So I'm curious how one deals with the challenge of helping someone tailor it to meet a market, yet still maintain their own personal voice and their own take on the writing, the topic, the formulation of the book, the structure of the book. You know, it seems to me there's a fine line in there. And I'm curious how a coach or development editor, it sounds more like this would be a more development editor role. How does one work with an author in that way so that they still feel like they own it, but are meeting the needs of a given market?
A process that worked really well at Ziff Davis Press was writers would send in sample chapters. I imagine that's still done. And the development editor would prepare an assessment. So part of the assessment could include literary voice. This author loves to use nature analogies, and he's writing a book about, you know, software that has nothing to do with that. So It's very time consuming, but it's about building that relationship up front. First of all, seeing if the author really cares about literary voice, because otherwise it's a non-issue, to be really blunt. But if a writer says, oh, I just don't feel like this is my book anymore. Actually, the writer needs to tell the editor way before it ever gets to that point. So it's really, I think a question of diplomatically saying, well, if we had been aware of this earlier, we could have addressed it. But hey, the pre-sales are great. Let's start talking about your next book so that we can, deal with this earlier in the process. So but really it's about spending that time up front to do everything one can to establish a good rapport with the writer. Like say, let's talk about literary voice. They might say, what is that? I just want to get this book done. I don't care about that. Or, oh, I like using certain analogies. Can we build that in as a motif or something? So yeah, just starting with the conversation.
Valerie, what first brought you to the written word and then later into publishing and then into writing?
Actually, publishing came first, then the written word as an editor, really, and then writing. I just realized how much I loved. I worked at a library in college, and I read a lot when I was in the library, and then kind of stopped. And then I started reading again, and I just said, man, I want to have something to do with books. So I looked in the blue pages under publishing and just said, oh, here are all these publishers. And around that time, I saw an ad from Osborne McGraw-Hill, and they were looking for a word processor to work with authors. So I applied as a freelance word processor, and I was able to learn some typesetting, some indexing, some editing while I was there. I took some classes at Etc. And then, I'd mentioned already that I went to Ziff Davis Press, and that's where I got interested in creating my own writing because I was doing so much ghostwriting. So I wrote traditional books, I wrote books about writing, and now that I feel I know the rules, I'm breaking them and having the time of my life. Thank you for asking, David.
And how does indexing fit in with all this? Because that's sort of out of left field, sort of.
That is my livelihood, Becky. So all of this talk about, coaching, that does bring some income also, but indexing is my day job.
But that would require a very different approach, a very different energy, I imagine, than either the writing or the editing or encouraging the writing. Do you ever find that those things are sort of discordant, or that you are in one mindset and you really have to force yourself into a different mindset in order to switch from one mode to another?
I used to when more indexing was being done, but because things have slowed down so much just because of ebooks or just all kinds of things, now the load is very manageable between indexing and editing. But yeah, it's so true that different types of editing require different types of focus, and indexing is speed reading to a great degree. So yeah, now it feels very manageable to go from indexing to creative writing to coaching to being here with all of you lovely people this evening.
The pregnant pause. It just occurred to me, I forgot to post in the chat, and I'll do so, that we have, for those who wish to help us out with information, a post-event survey, because we want to find out what people want to know. I know this one, a lot of us are eager for talking with you about this, so that's great. But I just want, before I forget, before everyone finishes up, we can keep going, but I just want to remind myself and all of you that to take the survey, I'm going to look and see if I can also email everybody. So do
Okay.
that too.
Well, actually, I really would love to know if anybody is working on a book or if anybody
Yeah.
wants input about their own creative writing, because Becky, as you were saying, we all have a book, we all have a story to tell. Knowing that that's a given and all of us have had something to do and a lot to do with the publishing industry, is there anybody on the edge of writing a book who wants to just talk about that a little bit?
I'll ask you a practical question.
Okay, David.
I'm not much of a creative writer, no, but I have to do a lot of writing for work. And that's a different beast. I know it's an entirely different beast, but it's interesting to me because it is also addressing an audience. And often if I have to create documentation, I have to think, how am I expressing this in a way that will be clear to people? And I've been doing it a long time, as I said, but one of the biggest challenges is starting. You know, you kind of addressed this already, but I tell you, my biggest challenge has been this thought that my first draft is supposed to be perfect. So I start writing and I can't even get the first sentence down, right? And eventually it flows and eventually it happens and it's fine. But I'm curious, in terms of your working with people, what tips do you have to get people beyond that block, that block of thinking this has to be perfect right off, or boy, I have no thoughts anymore. My thoughts is, how one's mind can go blank when faced with that kind of thing. So what type of advice do you give people when they need to just get going, or whatever it is? I'm referring to this kind of fairly mundane stuff, but I think it applies to anything we write. What kind of tips do you give people?
Well, I think perhaps the most valuable thing is to remember how you overcame it in the past. Just experience. I guess I tend not to be like, I'm so individualistic. It's not like I think I have 10 questions on my website or something like that. But generally, I don't think that way, just because I'm so much into individual processes and individual visions and all of that. But, I don't know, just off the top, does that sound at all useful? Because you know how you feel about your process. It just explained it to us clearly. So knowing that, have you ever sat down and has something come out perfectly the first time?
I may have thought it was perfect, but the second time I read it, I realized it was far from perfect. Yeah, no, never, ever, ever.
Well, you survived that.
Yes.
Right. But in terms of, is it something like you're asking the question, so is it something you really want to change? Or is it something that you can accept as your part of your process? I know I'm a perfectionist. I want this to come out perfectly. Okay, I wrote a paragraph. No, that's not perfect. Now what do I do? Yeah. Do you really want to change that process?
Well, I just had my 59th birthday, so nothing's going to change in that regard, right? So I think you hit on a really good point. It's understanding who you are and how you approach it, and not thinking about being someone. I have worked with people who are just able to just spit it out. That's just the way their minds work, right? And I think you raised a very good point. It's just an understanding. You look inside and say, yes, that is who I am, and I'm going to wander about a bit. I'm going to be standing up 3 or 4 times before I get flowing, and the first line's going to be awful, but I can always go back and change it. And I think it's that distinction between thinking of who you should be versus who you are that's probably critical there.
That does sound really useful. And also it raises a question of the very personal relationship we have with I'll call it our inner writer. You're the only one who knows how yours feels. For each of us who write, just being in that space. I would say something else that might be useful is to be more inviting to that writer within. It's like, okay, I mean, okay, we're going to write this article. I got to do it in 90 minutes now too. It's like, okay, let's write some notes, or, you tell me how. I have very personal relationships with my characters. And so it can be the relationship that you have to your process. Maybe deepening that relationship might help also as you accept your way of doing your writing.
That makes sense.
Cool.
Thank
Cool.
you.
I want to follow up on something you said, David, about feeling like it has to be perfect. And one thing that I've run into as an editor with many years of editing experience is when I write anything, even if it's a lengthy email. First of all, it is very hard. It is very hard to just let things come out and not have that inner editor, be stopping at every word. And it is a real. I don't know how. You talked about, Valerie, sort of accepting, that that's just who you are and that's, part of the process. But if the inner editor is stopping you from writing at all because it's not going to be perfect, how would you coach somebody to sort of get over that inhibition or that, just limitation?
Find an organic way to make a separation. I've mentioned journals, that's a very different type of writing, or maybe even on your computer. You mentioned writing emails specifically. So, that's one particular kind of writing. And yes, it is difficult to turn off the editor in writing an email, especially if it's professional. But you might open a little file, called Just for Fun, where you just write a bunch of stuff nobody else is going to read, and just as an exercise in turning off the editor. So I would say just separate it, probably get away from the computer. So using a notebook, a paper notebook might be better to just make the separation that much cleaner.
Yeah, I find, because I'm a designer, but I do some writing. I don't think I have a book in me, but or at least not yet. But because I do, for instance, songwriting and stuff, and also some narrative stuff. And I found what's really helped me is free writing, where you write without even thinking about what you're writing. Just let your hands go. And the idea of doing that with pencil on paper, or better yet, pen on paper, so you can't erase anything, it starts opening me up. And it's like a muscle. I've found that if I don't do it for a while, I got to kind of get myself worked back into that level of openness. And it gives me lots of new ideas and interesting vocabulary, but it also lets me be kinder to myself as a writer. I think that's how I would put it.
I'm so glad you mentioned free writing, Mimi, because that leads to writing prompts. So that if anybody really just wants to do free writing, I had the pleasure and opportunity to work with Pat Schneider, who wrote Writing Alone and with Others, among other books. And she was one of the founders of the Amherst Writers and Artists writing program. And Pat's book is full of writing prompts, and it's a very gentle, it's a very inviting book for anyone who is interested in experimenting with writing prompts. So when you free write, Mimi, is there a particular way you start, or it's just like you sit down and write whatever's on your mind? Or
I would say it's a mix. I mean, it sort of depends on what mood I'm in. But excuse me, I was taking a class that was taught by people who were using the prompts, a text class. It was a casual group that we got together with before the pandemic, and they would read a prompt, and you could either write to that prompt or totally ignore it, and however you wished. And that really helped me get started in free writing. Sometimes I just want to say, what's going to come out? I have no idea. Let's just see what happens. So, but yeah, the prompts are really lovely too, because I like that they shift your perspective a little bit, so you're not so in you and in your head so much. You're actually able to see a little more, step back just a little bit. That's how it feels to me.
For some reason, that reminds me of David Solanka's question from earlier. For writers who, when any of us, well, when a writer writes something and it's like, oh, this is trash. If it were paper, I'd throw it in the trash. It can be useful to say, why am I calling this bad writing? Is it because it's not coming out the way I wanted it to? Or is there something here I really need to pay attention to? Because something that comes up mainly in long form writing, a book of some sort, books take on a life of their own, unless you're a very structured writer where things have to happen a certain way. No judgment, no right or wrong way to do it. But what writers tend to find, writers in our circles tend to find absolutely exhilarating. In fact, one of the writers is writing this a science fiction novel that's extremely intricate. So she came to the circle and said, yep, this is gonna happen, that's gonna happen. This is a couple of years ago now. And I just love to ask her, so are your characters doing what you want them to do? And she says, nope. she never knows what to expect. But I think there's something to that, even with business writing, let's say. And it's a way of being gentler with oneself. It's like, no, this is not what I wanted it to be. I mean, if you knew what it was, you would have written that, right? So, we go through these drafts of things, and I think we can more easily be kind to ourselves. And it's like, yeah, this is interesting, but I'm writing about sausages, and this book is really supposed to be about pizza. So, there's that whole thing. In terms of staying on point, but there's really no reason to beat yourselves up. That's the whole thing. I hate when writers are mean to themselves, so I just want to encourage everybody to be kind to themselves and to others.
I think you raise an excellent point, because often what it's highlighting is in the writing process, you're developing it in the writing process. You've got a concept in your head that your character is going to be a certain way, or even that the process you're trying to document is going to work in a certain way. But as you write, you discover, I was wrong. That process can't work that way. Or really, this character would never relate to this other character this way. It doesn't make sense. They're really this kind of person. So I think whether it's fiction, nonfiction, documentation, the idea of writing as being a development of your concept for me personally, that's a very helpful way to think about it. I'm developing and finalizing my concept by putting it down in writing and trying to document, whether I'm documenting a story or a process, I'm documenting it. And that makes it unfold, that uncovers the intricacies of the piece.
That was beautiful. Yeah. And I can say, in writing fiction, there's nothing like the euphoria of writing. You think you know where something's going, and then this character, just takes you someplace. And I love when I get to that point where it's like, my goodness, I had no idea you felt that way. It's just all of these surprises. So it's just it's totally empowering, because you get to make up everything you want in fiction. But I'm grateful. And a couple of writers have been saying lately, one writer I work with is very structured. So I said, maybe you want to try to loosen up a little bit. She did, and that didn't work for her. She's a structured writer, but she said, I'm saving that writing because I know this wasn't a waste of time, because I believe it will be useful later on. Mm-hmm. So, I think that can be helpful too, in those times when you spend an hour writing something and it's like, no, I know it needs to be different. It could be like leading to something else, part 2 in a series, or, you were writing a business article and my goodness, what a great idea for a short story,
Yeah. I can also see how one learns about themselves in this process.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Well, that's in writing fiction, it can be so. I admire fiction writers who really are able to write about personalities that are diametrically different from themselves because most of my characters, let's just say, I tend to have things in common with them. So, yes, you do learn a lot about yourself.
Have you ever, in working, I guess, more with nonfiction authors, have you ever worked with writing teams where multiple authors are working on a piece, whether it's technical writing or research writing? I'm curious about how that process works, about how writers collaborate with each other.
That's something I have never done. The closest would be, editing or indexing a book, a multi-author project, but not there on the front line with creating the content.
I guess when you and David were having our conversation, I was thinking about writers who do who do have to stick to a structure or do have to get to a defined point, and how you get back on track. I mean, I loved your comment that yes, you can take that idea that came out of it, even if it doesn't fit in this context, you can put it aside for the next thing. But I wonder how you sort of keep yourself, how one keeps oneself as a writer within a pretty defined structure, without inhibiting yourself or without kind of limiting yourself too much. I guess it's just inherently a limited sort of writing if you have to stick to a certain structure or set of facts or things like that.
I find it useful in cases like that to always ask, well, with fiction, but this could apply to nonfiction as well. Okay, where is the story going? At some point you write a first draft and it's like, okay, it's time to get down to business. I do want to tell something that's, at least loosely cohesive, where just to constantly say, where's the story going? Depending on the topic. Okay, am I on point here? How does this really fit into the big picture? So it can be part of internal dialogue to just consciously make those, do those checks from time to time. Or again, depending on process, if you write a whole article, hopefully it's not too long just because it'll be less work to edit if it's shorter. But even if you write the whole article, then it's like, okay, am I sticking to the point? And if you have the flexibility, you might find, oh no, it's not about this thing I started to write about, but it's about this other related thing. And I can still, it's not salvage it, but I can just kind of present it in a different way. But yeah, to just, have, again, clarity and intention.
Yeah, no, that's really great. That's really great to keep in mind.
Mm-hmm.
I do that with songwriting sometimes. It's like, oh God, I love this verse. It's not fitting, but I love what I'm saying, or this line or something. And there's definitely, and my designs too, sometimes I'll have something about a design that I'm creating for a book or whatever. And it's not working for this book, but it's good. And so I have a little stash of things I love that I've done that I haven't used yet. And I'll pull from that sometimes.
Wow. Yeah. Actually, if you don't mind, Nina, I'd like to ask you a question based on what Mimi was sharing about her songwriting. Nina is a poet, and Mimi was just explaining how she will put away verses and then, my goodness, they come into play later. I'm just interested, Nina, does that happen with your poetry writing sometimes? Please unmute. Thank you. Thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you for asking, but I don't think that's ever happened, that I put it away for later. I either use it or don't use it, and then maybe it pops up again in some other form several years later. But I'm very old, and so when I say several years later, it could be decades later.
But it seems similar, somewhat similar. You were clear about your process, Nina, yet it seems similar that I think it's fascinating that something that you explore at one point comes back decades later or the next day or whenever it is. That seems like a beautiful part of the process too.
Inspiring too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, Nina.
Oh, you're welcome. I'm finding this all very interesting.
Oh, I'm so glad.
Yeah.
Me too.
I'm wondering, I mean, is the process of writing poetry, substantially different than writing fiction or nonfiction? I've always been sort of mystified by how poets are able to write
Yes.
what they do. So I'm wondering if you can comment on how the process is different for you.
Well, I've only written one novel and many years worth of poetry. So they have been very different because you need beginning, middle, and end for your novel, and it has to keep moving. And what was the question now? I've lost it.
Just how creating poetry it is the process that you go through. Does it sound very different from what Valerie has been describing about writing fiction?
The process of poetry and the
Yeah.
process of fiction?
Yeah.
Yes, because fiction, you have to have an ending.
Hmm.
And with poetry, you only have to have completed the feeling.
Mm.
Or maybe that's not right, but that's how it is for me.
No, I like that.
Oh, that's a beautiful explanation. Thank you, Nina.
Oh, you're welcome.
Hmm.
Well, I think we're coming close to the end. It's almost 7 o'clock. So I want to thank everybody for attending our event. Thank you so much. It was great to have you all here, and I was really glad to hear all of your questions. And thank you very much to Valerie, who for agreeing to join us and to enlighten us all, hopefully to inspire us to start writing and keep writing, and with the writers that we work with, to to be encouraging and to be nurturing and to just keep the process going. So thank you so much.
Thank
And
you.
I also want to, I'm sorry, I also want to just mention again the survey, that the post-event survey that we're going to send out. And David Zalanka had put in the chat window a fact about PPN, which is having a year-end membership drive. So please check that out.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Becky. And for everyone for being here instead of all the other places you could have been.
Thank you, Valerie. It was really fascinating.
Yeah.
So great, Valerie. Thank you.
Thank you. My
Yeah.
pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you all. My pleasure. Thank you.
I got a lot out of it as a designer who
Really?
I'm one of those rare designers that loves working with authors, and I miss that.
Wow.
And
Huh.
it sometimes can be really challenging. And I felt like I got a lot of insight into sort of how author minds work and things that I can do to approach them in an encouraging and supportive way that also helps us get things done.
Oh,
So
fantastic.
it's nice. I really appreciate this, Valerie.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you. I'm so grateful, Mimi. Thank you.
Oops, Becky,
I want-
you're muted.
I want to thank David Van Ness for inviting me to be on the advisory board in the first place. And I want to thank David, Becky, and Mimi for inviting me to the professional development meeting that led to the invitation for this event. And David Solanka, thank you so much for welcoming me to the organization.
Thank you for all you're doing.
Yeah.
We are so lucky you said yes.
Thank you. Thank you. My pleasure. My
All right,
pleasure.
and everyone, please stay tuned for the next exciting installment in our professional development series.
Mhm.
Okay, will do. Thank you.
Great.
All right.
Thank you,
Thank
everybody.
you, everyone.
A wonderful evening.
Likewise. Okay, good night.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.